Stories tour. My name is Kirsten. Thank you so much for watching. We're starting today's tour right up at the top of Edinburgh's Old Town, and as you can see from this picture that I took a few years ago, we're right in front of Edinburgh Castle, that one-time royal household and fortress. By 1853, an important year in our story, it was a military base and had also relatively recent opened to the public for visits. So we're going to take a step back, and we're now looking at another photograph, this one taken from the roof of the National Museum of Scotland. And it is a great vantage point because you can see the castle there, up there on the top of that craggy volcanic rock with the great sheer cliffs underneath it, making it such a perfect defensive site. And if you look just a little way to the right of the castle, you should see sticking up from some of the other buildings there a tower. It's white painted with a black domed roof to it, and that is the building that we're going to be focusing more on today. So now we're back on the castle esplanade, but we've turned 180 degrees. So the castle is now behind us, and we're looking down that main street of the old town of Edinburgh, the Royal Mile, and on the left-hand side of it, you can see there the Camera Obscura. The Camera Obscura is the earliest purpose-built visitor attraction that we have in Edinburgh, and in particular today, we're going to be looking at the story of its rather intriguing and forthright founder, Maria Theresa Short. And in order to start that story, we're going to make our way to another of Edinburgh's 7 hills. We're now up on Carlson Hill, and behind me in the distance there you can see Edinburgh Castle, which we've just come from, up on its hill, and we can just and so make out the Camera Obscura. If you looked to the left of the castle, you should be able to see a tall pointed spire there, and in between it and the castle there's a little smaller round turret, a little bit of scaffolding on it at the moment, and that is the Camera Obscura that we were just looking at. In 1827, a rather mysterious woman arrived in Edinburgh. She looked to all to be in her early 20s, and she claimed to be Maria, the daughter of Thomas Short. Thomas had been a local scientific instrument maker here in Edinburgh, and he had been in the process of building an observatory up here on Carlton Hill when he had died fairly suddenly 40 years earlier. Now, the location of Thomas's observatory is just behind me here, and as I turn round, you'll be able to see that there are some observatory buildings there. Now, by the time that Maria arrived in Edinburgh, Thomas's observatory had already been replaced by this one that's behind me now. This one was built by the great architect William Playfair, and the only part of Thomas's observatory that still survived then as now is the little Gothic tower, as it's known, that you can see behind me here. This had been built by James Craig, and this was where Thomas and his family lived. So this was Thomas, his young wife Jacobina, and their children. So on Thomas's death, Jacobina assumed that she would inherit the house here and the business. However, there was a little bit of a legal technicality. There was a clause in the contract that Thomas had signed when he had been granted the money by Edinburgh Council to build his observatory here that said that any wife of Thomas would only inherit if there was a son, for everything to be passed on to into the future. Now, Thomas and Jacobina had been married for about 10 years, and in that time they had had about 10 children. We don't know exactly how many. Of course, sadly, but perhaps not surprisingly, for the late 18th century, most in fact, of the children had predeceased Thomas. However, there was one son, 2 daughters still surviving, and Jacobina was pregnant, so there was another on the way as well. So with that son in place, Jacobina assumed that everything was fine. However, another tragedy struck. That young lad died literally within days of his father, so one can only imagine what this must have done to Jacobina. She was facing the tragedy of losing another child, and on top of that, with him, everything that she was due to inherit. So Jacobina, along with her daughters, were thrown out of their home and left destitute. On top of that, Edinburgh Council also seized Thomas's prized exhibit. This was the Great Telescope. The telescope had been built by Thomas's brother, so Maria's uncle, and when it was first completed, it was considered to be the most powerful telescope in the world. It had been a commission for the King of Denmark, but once it had been completed, the king realised he didn't actually have the money to pay for it, so the telescope remained in the Short family. So on Thomas's death, the council seized the telescope and they threw it into a back room of the city chambers and left it there to rust. But now here was Maria. So the youngest daughter of Thomas had never met her father, of course, because she had been born in the months after he had died. So at least here was someone who said she was Maria, and she was back in Edinburgh, and she was claiming that the telescope was rightfully hers. As you can see, we're now in front of the City Observatory, and if I turn the camera slowly around here, you'll be able to see behind me this tall tower. This is the monument to Admiral Nelson. It's designed to look a bit like a telescope that's been put on its side, and it's also got a time ball up at the top there. By the time Maria arrived in Edinburgh, this had been constructed about 10 years previously. Now, Edinburgh Council clearly felt pretty bad about the way that they had treated Maria's family, and so they should. They looked a little bit into her identity, and they found a few Edinburgh citizens who were prepared to vouch for her. They said that they had known her in the first few years of her life before her family moved off over to Ireland and onto the West Indies. So they worked on the assumption that she was indeed the daughter of Thomas Short. So they gave her the telescope, and they also granted her permission for her big idea. And that was that Maria wanted to build her own observatory up here on Carlson Hill underneath the Nelson monument there. Hers was to be quite different from the one that was already here, in that hers was to be a popular observatory, so open to anybody who wanted to visit for the price of a shilling. The objections came in thick and fast. In 19th century Edinburgh, astronomical equipment was really reserved purely for the academic elite. And the idea that the general populace, women, the working class and all, would have access to these instruments of knowledge and learning horrified the scientific circles. But Maria wasn't interested in their concerns. She built her observatory, and it was nothing like as grand as the City Observatory that was already here, but it had the Great Telescope. And alongside that, she had microscopes, kaleidoscopes, all sorts of technological marvels of the day. The most popular exhibit, however, was always the camera obscura. So this was a system of mirrors rigged up in the roof of the building that would project a live image onto the floor of a darkened room of the night skies. And Maria's promotional pamphlets said that the camera obscura would be open every night until 9 o'clock in the evening, and even later if it was a clear night. In later years, she had an even better idea, and that was that she turned the mirrors upside down, so that instead of reflecting the sky, what was projected onto the floor of that darkened room was an image of the surrounding streets of the city. So visitors could watch in real time the hustle and bustle, the people moving around the capital. Now this is what still takes place up at the camera obscura on Castle Hill these days, and even now it remains hugely popular and a great spectacle. So one can only imagine what a great marvel it must have been to the people of the 19th century. So people flocked to the observatory. They really did love it and came in great numbers. However, of course, there were always the objectors, those members of that slightly snobbish scientific elite who were not so pleased with Maria and her establishment. Maria and the popular observatory survived repeated attempts at its closure. The council were receiving complaints about it almost daily. Some said that they thought the building itself was tacky and that it marked the first step in a downwards progress in terms of the types of popular entertainment that might start appearing in the city. Of course, the issue of Maria's identity kept on resurfacing. If she was not who she said, then did she have any right at all to be operating the observatory? Others were more concerned with her tireless self-promotion. In particular, they felt very harassed, they said, when they were walking past underneath the hill here, where Maria was often to be found trying to push promotional pamphlets into their hands. So goodness knows what they would make of Edinburgh during festival times these days. On that count, she defended herself in court, saying that visitors to the city would have no idea that the observatory existed, so she needed to be out here in order to inform them and to direct them. And her promotional activities evidently worked. People continued to flock to the observatory until disaster struck. In 1851, the council gave in to the complainants and ordered Maria shut her doors. And this was despite the fact that a petition went around the city and gathered around 4,000 signatures requesting that the observatory be able to remain where it was. And of course, Maria was such a stubborn woman. She was going to carry on operating. She continued, in fact, until the council decided they had to take matters into their own hands. And the action they took was pretty drastic. They sent a gang of men up to the top of the hill in the middle of the night to destroy the observatory. They took all of Maria's valuable equipment, threw it out onto the grass, and then they tore the whole building down. So that was certainly it for the popular observatory on Carlson Hill. However, it was not it for Maria. Now, if she was who she said she was, then she would have been in her early 60s at this point, so it might have been a moment for her to step back. But of course, that was not what she was going to do. She picked herself up and her husband, she'd married a couple of years earlier, and they made their way up to another of the city viewpoints, up to Carlson Hill. So that's where we're going to head back to just now. Well, we're now back up on Carlson Hill with Edinburgh Castle once again just behind us. After the closure of the popular observatory on Carlson Hill, Maria and her husband bought this stone tower house and built the tower on the top for the camera obscura. They moved in all of Maria's equipment, and in 1853 they opened as Short's Observatory. Now at this time, in the 19th century, Edinburgh's old town was very run down, and most people were living in slum conditions. It would have been quite a contrast from Carlson Hill on the edge of the elegant and upmarket new town. Here, once again, the observatory flourished, and Maria ran it successfully for the rest of her life. Then her husband took over, and when he died, it ended up in the hands of Patrick Geddes, the famous town planner and improver of the old town. Sadly, by the early 20th century, Maria was slightly being erased from history. Guidebooks to Edinburgh were listing Short's Observatory, claiming it was named for the scientific instrument maker Thomas. Thankfully, over more recent decades, we have come to realise that the observatory here was nothing to do with Thomas. This was all Maria. And what about Maria? She and her husband lived out their lives within the tower of the camera obscura, but we still don't really know about Maria's true identity. In the census of 1861, her listed age would have made her 15 years too young to be the daughter of Jacobina and Thomas Short. But the census would have been completed by Maria's husband, who might have had his own reasons to lie, or possibly didn't even know the truth himself. She died in 1869, and at the time it was said she was aged around 70, although if she was who she claimed, she would have been more like 80 years old. In any case, it doesn't really matter who her parents were or where she came from. She was an audacious and stubborn woman who didn't bow to pressure, but created a space where thousands of people could have access to scientific equipment and technology that they would never have otherwise have had the chance to experience. And in doing so, she created an attraction that has enthralled and delighted millions ever since. Not a bad legacy at all. Now, I just wanted to end this story of Maria with a little postscript. because she was such a strong-willed woman, and we have to wonder where perhaps she got this fantastic attitude from, and maybe, just maybe, it was from her mother, from Jacobina. And I have to credit a great researcher and writer, Alison Reiko Loader, with this rather amazing story about Jacobina. So when Jacobina and Thomas married, Thomas was in his mid-60s, whereas Jacobina was 18, perhaps 19 years old at most. Thomas was in a really good position at this point. He was building his observatory, he had really good prospects, he had a very good income, he had this lovely house, the Gothic Tower, just behind me here, and Jacobina knew she stood to inherit all of it, with the one condition, of course, that they have a surviving son on Thomas's death. She had no idea, of course, of the tragedy that was to befall her when Thomas died, and he died suddenly. His death report recorded that he collapsed when he was out walking one day. So she had no idea that, of course, her son would die within just days of Thomas. So, of course, she was indeed, along with her daughters, thrown out of this wonderful home here, and it was given instead to Thomas's oldest grandson and his wife to move into. But Jacobina was not going to take this lying down. She returned just a few days later with a group of 12 men that she'd gathered up. They had swords and they had blunderbusses, and they came in and they managed to attack and force their way into the Gothic Tower here. And one man within the tower, it has to be said, was fairly seriously hurt. The others were just pretty terrified by this attack. And there were a number of the city guard around here on Carlson Hill at the time. They arrested Jacobina and her accomplices, and 4 of them got taken to court, including Jacobina and another man called Joseph McFadden. Now, Jacobina and one of the other men got off without any charges, whereas Joe McFadden and the other man did get sent to prison. And McFadden, he saw out his year-long sentence and then paid a fine and was released. And when he was released, he went and moved in with Jacobina. And they then spent the rest of their lives together. They never got formally married, but according to some, apparently the daughters started calling him Dad. And we don't know if there was anything going on between Joseph and Jacobina before Thomas's death. But a little sort of interesting nugget to the story is that Joseph was, by profession, he was a pharmacist. And he was, in fact, none other than Thomas Short's own personal pharmacist. And one wonders how wise it is to have, as the person giving you daily doses of drugs, the man who is perhaps potentially your wife's lover and who would stand to co-inherit your home, your family, your business, your income on your death. And as we mentioned, his death, he died collapsing unexpectedly whilst out on a walk. So just a little thought to leave you with there. Hello, I am back with one more postscript to Maria's story, and with, of course, my post-lockdown haircut. And this is because I thought I was done with the video and I was ready to upload it, and I was watching it back and I was really quite shocked at the casual way that I had mentioned the family being in the West Indies, and particularly at the time that we're talking about, it would have been somewhere around 1800, 1810, 1820. And of course, at that time, the main reason that anyone from Scotland or indeed from Britain was likely to have been in the West Indies would have been to do with the sugar plantations there, which of course ran entirely on the mass enslavement of black people. So I thought that this was a subject worth having another little look into. So I looked back over all of the sources that I had used, and all of them had almost exactly word for word the same sentence, mentioning that the Maria Short, who had arrived in Edinburgh in 1827, had spent time in her youth in the West Indies before going over to Ireland to live with her sister there, and it was from there that she came over to Edinburgh. So it doesn't mention any of the rest of the family being in the West Indies. So it's certainly something that there is scope, I think, for a bit more research into the actual documentation over in the West Indies about whether or not there was a Maria Short over there. Of course, it would be quite complicated, as we don't know if the Maria Short who arrived in Edinburgh had the same name when she was over there, whether she really was that daughter of Thomas and Jacobina, of course. However, there was one bit of research that I was able to do, and this relates to a database that has been put together by UCL, University College London, and this relates to the fact that Britain formally abolished slavery in 1833, and when they did, they gave out a vast amount of money in compensation, not, of course, to the people who had been enslaved, but to the former slave owners for what they were calling, of course, the loss of their property. So there is an excellent documentary, 2 parts, on the BBC. It's on the iPlayer. Highly recommend it. It's called Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, fronted by David Olusoga. It's really very good. I'll put links to it in the notes below the video. So this is a list of all of the names of the people who claimed for this compensation, and lots of details about what they were claiming for and all the rest of it. And UCL have put all of this information onto a very easily searchable database. So I did go onto that because, of course, Maria at this point in 1833 was in Edinburgh. She was at that point running the Observatory up on Carlson Hill, of course. And so I searched her name, I searched her husband's name, I searched her mother and John McFadden, and any name that I could think of that was related to them. And I did draw a blank. So that does make me hopeful that she was not involved in slavery herself. However, of course, I know that doesn't completely absolve her. There's no conclusive evidence there. So I would be very grateful if anybody had any more information or any other sort of ways of researching it and so on. Please do comment in the comments down below. That'd be wonderful. I'd love to hear from you on that. So with that, I'd like to say thank you once again for watching, and hope to see you next time for another of these Scots stories. Bye just now.